The mortar and rocket fire stops for a moment, our chance to escape. We have been 1 kilometre from the front line, and what we have seen has changed our perception of this rebel force. They've demonstrated more know-how than we had given them credit for, and their courage and determination are undeniable. Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, outside Ras Lanuf in eastern Libya.
Russia has announced it will ban all weapons sales to Libya, suspending its contracts with the government there. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi has sent representatives around the world to hold talks. Libya's deputy defense minister is in Cairo, where it's believed he'll meet Egypt's military council and the Arab League. Meanwhile, the question of whether to impose a no-fly zone is at the top of the agenda for the international community. France's President Nicolas Sarkozy is due to meet envoys of Libya's rebel National Council in Paris in the coming hours. NATO's defense ministers will talk Libya in their regular meeting in Brussels later this Thursday. The alliance said on Wednesday it was not planning on any military intervention, but would be ready to respond if needed. Also in Belgium, the EU's foreign affairs representative will hold a working lunch to discuss the Libya uprising. Al Jazeera's reporters are watching developments across Europe. Let's go now to Tanya Page. She's in Brussels. Tanya, NATO is meeting. It says it's one of its regular meetings, but Libya will feature on the agenda. What are we expecting to come out of that?
Well, look, what we can expect, we hope for at least, is a bit more clearer direction on what NATO's position is. We had NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen saying that NATO was not going to intervene, but that it was standing by. So all options are going to be discussed and on the table at the meeting, which will get underway in the next few hours. Positions variable, though, heading into it. We've seen the UK and France lobbying and preparing a draft resolution for the UN. They're hoping for some kind of UN resolution that will give a broader support and broader mandate for NATO. However, that is not essential for NATO to take action.
So just to clarify the situation, NATO is looking for the lead from the United Nations on imposing any kind of a no-fly zone or indeed any military action whatsoever.
Look, ideally NATO would want that UN resolution. However, it isn't essential. NATO has many options on the table. They're all going to be discussed because nothing's been taken off the table at this point in time. What those options may include, of course, the most discussed and debated one is the potential for a no-fly zone. Now, that is a term that can cover a broad range of issues as well, because a no-fly zone could be implemented across the entire country. However, as we know, Libya, most of it, vast swathes of it, are desert. The population is 85% of the population at least is along that sort of 100 kilometres deep from the coastline. So the potential of a no-fly zone over the whole country seems slightly irrelevant, but the potential of a narrower no-fly zone over those more populated areas are being discussed. But there are several threats, of course, NATO has to consider, not least of all the ground-to-air missile defences that Libya has, and one of the issues that US Defence Secretary Robert Gates has raised, that look, there's no point in a no-fly zone unless you go in and target those ground-to-air defences, and then do you also target the runways? So lots of variables, and all of them carrying some risk as well.
Tanya, what is the breakdown among those delegates there at NATO? As you mentioned, there is an initiative which has been put forward for a no-fly zone to be imposed by the United Kingdom and France. But is there any opposition being expressed to that kind of action by other NATO members?
Look, there's a lot of caution. I mean, particularly from the United States. We've seen really UK Prime Minister David Cameron taking the lead in terms of his rhetoric. Obama has said, they had both in fact said that Gaddafi's got to go, but how they affect that is the big question really. A lot of that caution on behalf of the United States is surrounding, you know, they don't want to be seen to be a Western power going in and intervening or meddling in affairs there without also some support from Gulf and Arab nations. Of course, you know, they've also seen in the last few days Gaddafi come out and say that, you know, this is the West trying to steal our oil wealth and oil reserves. So the potential of military action in Libya taken by the West, by NATO, may they fear in some way play into Gaddafi's hands in strengthening and solidifying his support base.
All right, thanks, Tanya. Tanya Page there in Brussels. And we have let's go to Moscow now and talk to Niamh Barker. Niamh, the Russians have just passed a decree, or rather the president there has announced a decree banning all arms sales to Libya. Would this be something new? Because Russia is already party to that UN resolution which bans all arms sales to Libya. That resolution was passed about 10 days ago. Is this simply a ratification of that resolution, or is it something that reinforces the ban on arms sales to Libya?
Well, it appears at face value to be a reinforcement of that earlier agreement signed on February the 26th, essentially putting into action here in Russia that full embargo on arms sales, arms deliveries of Russian weapons to Libya. Reiterating that earlier embargo, President Medvedev announced that any flights, any deliveries, any cargo trains suspected of shipping arms in the direction of Libya would be examined and subject to strict prosecution should any cargo be found to be in breach of these new sanctions against Libya. A strong and perhaps a bold move forward for the Russians. Of course, Libya had been, in the second half of the 20th century at least, the biggest buyer of Russian weapons anywhere in the world. Ever since the country opened up to Western investment, perhaps Russia had hoped that Libya would become a new buyer once again, but of course that isn't the case. Russia has joined the international community in blocking all deliveries, all sales of weapons to the country.
All right, thanks, Niamh. Niamh Barker there in Moscow with that update. Now, an earthquake has struck a remote area of southwest China. At least 7 people are so far known to have been killed close to the border with Myanmar. The epicenter of the 5.8 magnitude quake was southwest of Dali town in Yunnan province. Many houses and buildings are reported to have collapsed. The Dalai Lama has announced he'll be formally stepping down as political head of the exiled Tibetan movement. He says it's time for a, quote, freely elected leader to take over. He announced this on Thursday, the anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan uprising against Chinese rule. However, he remains as Tibet's spiritual leader. So what does this mean for the Tibetan exile movement and China, which has long been campaigning against the Dalai Lama? To answer that question, we have Joseph Cheng, a professor of political science at the City University of Hong Kong. Thanks for joining us, sir. So exactly what is the significance of the Dalai Lama saying he's going to step down as the political head of the movement?
Well, the Dalai Lama has been interested in establishing and consolidating a democratic system in the exiled Tibetan community. This is probably a very wise way and the best way to maintain the unity and the international appeal of the exiled Tibetan community